Welcome to Life Stories. Today, we share a deeply emotional journey of love, betrayal, and resilience. Christina, a widow raising her daughter Emma on her own, faces a nightmare when her in-laws abandon her 10-year-old daughter during a hospital stay. What follows is a battle for justice, a struggle to protect her child, and ultimately, a journey of healing and self-discovery. This story isn't just about overcoming family conflict. It's about protecting the ones you love and learning the true meaning of responsibility and trust. Stay tuned as we dive into this powerful story. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's journey. I still remember the panic I felt in the hospital room. My heart racing so fast it felt like I couldn't catch my breath. It was the worst moment of my life so far, and I didn't know how to hold it together. My voice cracked as I screamed into the phone. "You're not going to leave her alone." I had no idea how I was supposed to handle this. The cold, sterile walls of the hospital room seemed to close in around me. My chest tightened with every passing second. I could barely focus on the nurse who was checking my IV. Her movements mechanical in the background as I held my phone to my ear, desperately trying to make sense of what was happening. I could hear Emma's frightened sobs on the other end of the line. "Mommy, Grandma and Grandpa just drove away," she cried, her voice shaky and terrified. "I'm here alone. They said they're going to Uncle Peter's party and that I'm old enough to stay by myself. I'm scared." Those words hit me like a ton of bricks. My precious 10-year-old daughter, left alone, abandoned in the place that should have been her safe haven. The very people who were supposed to protect her, my in-laws, had decided that their celebration was more important than her safety. My thoughts spun out of control, rage and disbelief mixing with fear for Emma. My name is Christina, though everyone calls me Chris. I'm 36 years old, a widow who has been raising my daughter on my own since my husband, Michael, passed away in a car accident 3 years ago. Since his death, Emma had struggled with anxiety, often waking up from nightmares, afraid that something would happen to me too. I did everything I could to ease her fears. But this moment, had confirmed her worst nightmare. "Are you serious right now?" I nearly screamed as I heard my father-in-law, Gerald's dismissive voice on the phone. "She needs to toughen up. She's not a baby anymore. We'll be back in a few hours." "A few hours?" I wanted to shout. "She's 10. It's illegal to leave a child that age alone. Get back to my house immediately," I ordered, trying to hold my composure. But then Barbara, my mother-in-law, chimed in. "We're already halfway to Peter's. It's his 60th birthday, and the whole family will be there." Emma was invited too, but she didn't want to come. "That's her choice." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Here I was, stuck in a hospital bed recovering from an emergency gallbladder surgery, unable to do anything, while they, my daughter's grandparents, had abandoned her for a party. How could they be so thoughtless? I felt the tears sting my eyes as I imagined Emma alone in that house. Terrified and vulnerable, I tried to keep my voice steady, though it was shaking with anger and fear. "I'm calling Janet right now to check on Emma," I told them. "When I get out of here tomorrow, you will never have unsupervised access to my daughter again." Barbara dismissed me with a scoff. "You're being dramatic as usual, Chris. Michael would have understood. You're the one making her soft. Using my late husband against me. That was the final straw. How dare they?" I ended the call with a sharp click, feeling both furious and helpless. As I dialed Janet's number, my hands trembled. Thank God she answered right away and promised to go check on Emma. I was terrified of what I might find, but at least I had someone who cared enough to step in. The reality of what had just happened began to settle over me like a thick fog. This wasn't just some isolated lapse in judgment. This was who my in-laws really were. They had shown me their true colors, and I had been blind to it for too long. My husband, Michael, had always defended me from their criticisms. He was the buffer, the one who kept the peace between us. But now, with him gone, the veil had lifted. For years, they'd subtly criticized my parenting, telling me Emma was too attached to me, that I was spoiling her. Michael had always defended me, but now I was on my own. I had grown up in a home where love was inconsistent, where guidance was a luxury I could never rely on. I promised myself I would be different with Emma. I would give her the stability and security I never had. But now, as I lay in that hospital bed, I realized that the people I had trusted most in my life had betrayed me. They had chosen a party over their granddaughter's well-being. When I first got the call about my surgery, I was in excruciating pain. The doctor said I needed to have my gallbladder removed immediately. Panicked about Emma being alone, I called everyone I knew. Janet could only help part-time due to her work schedule, and my closest friends were out of town. Desperate, I turned to Barbara and Gerald. They agreed to stay with Emma for the 3 days I'd be hospitalized. Seemingly happy to help, the relief I felt when they said they'd stay with her was immense. At least I thought I could rest easy knowing they would look after her. I even felt guilty for pushing them away all those years. Family is what matters in a crisis, Barbara had said while packing an overnight bag for me. She convinced me that despite our differences, they would be there for me when it counted. But I couldn't have been more wrong. I trusted them with Emma, and they betrayed that trust. The guilt I felt for having believed them, for having allowed them into my life so fully, was overwhelming. Now, as I lay there, helpless in the hospital bed, I realized the extent of the betrayal. I was no longer just upset. I was devastated. The walls of the hospital room felt like they were closing in on me. Not because of the surgery, but because of this deep, gut-wrenching betrayal by the very people who were supposed to protect what mattered most to me, my daughter. The truth was out. My in-laws had shown me who they were, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. This was just the beginning, and I had no idea what was going to happen next. But I knew one thing. Things would never be the same again. I wouldn't let it be. For Emma's sake, I would fight, no matter what. The days following the phone call were a blur of emotions, confusion, and a deep sense of betrayal. As I lay in the hospital bed, my body recovering from surgery, my mind raced with the consequences of what had just transpired. It wasn't just the shock of my in-laws abandoning Emma that stung. It was the realization that I had placed my trust in people who didn't see the value of protecting my child. This wasn't a mistake. This was a choice. I had tried so hard to maintain some semblance of peace between Emma and her grandparents. Despite their constant undermining of my parenting, I had swallowed my pride for the sake of Emma's connection to her father's family. I had hoped that keeping some distance would be enough to protect her. But this was a line they had crossed that could never be uncrossed. By the time Janet called back with news that she had Emma safe at her house, my anger had reached its boiling point. Emma was shaken, but Janet reassured me that she was all right, at least for the moment. She promised to keep Emma until I was discharged from the hospital the next day. As I heard those words, a rush of relief flooded through me, but it was quickly replaced with a sharp, bitter reality. My in-laws had put my daughter at risk. What if something had happened to me during surgery? What if I hadn't been able to come home? The thought made my blood run cold. That evening, the weight of what had happened finally hit me. I realized just how much danger Emma had been in. If there had been a fire, or if someone had broken into the house, or if Emma had gotten hurt in any way, it could have been catastrophic. I wasn't just angry anymore, I was terrified. I knew I had to take action, and I had to do it fast. I called Child Protective Services, CPS, from my hospital bed. The social worker was kind, yet firm as she took my statement, listening carefully to every word. When she told me that leaving a child that young alone was considered neglect under state law, it felt like a confirmation of what I had already known deep down. I wasn't overreacting. This wasn't a small mistake. It was a violation of Emma's safety and well-being. The call to CPS was a turning point for me. I was no longer simply a mother trying to manage a difficult situation. I was a mother who had to protect her child at all costs. The social worker explained the process, and though her words were comforting, they didn't lessen the gravity of what lay ahead. A full investigation would take place, and both my in-laws and I would be interviewed. But in my heart, I knew what was right. I had to do this, not just for Emma's sake, but for my own peace of mind. The phone rang just as I was hanging up with CPS. It was Gerald. The audacity of him to call after everything that had happened made my blood boil. He was furious, demanding to know what I had told the authorities. "What did you tell them?" he bellowed. "They're coming to interview us about Emma. This is ridiculous." I steadied myself, trying not to let his anger shake me. "I told them the truth. That you abandoned my daughter to go to a party while I was in the hospital." Barbara's voice joined in from the background. It was a family gathering. Not some wild party. She was perfectly fine. "This is an overreaction, Tina." I could feel my pulse quicken, my hands gripping the phone tighter as I fought to remain calm. "No, Gerald, you abandoned her. You left a 10-year-old alone when she needed you most. She was terrified, and you didn't care." There was a long pause before Gerald spoke again, his voice tinged with anger and guilt. "We're her grandparents. We have rights." Something in me snapped. "Rights?" I nearly laughed through the frustration. "You think leaving a child alone is a right? You have responsibilities, Gerald, and you completely abandoned them." The words that followed felt like a punch to the gut. "You've always been dramatic, Tina," Barbara said dismissively. "Michael would have understood. You're just making Emma soft." I felt my heart break for the 100th time that day. Using Michael against me. Using his memory as a way to manipulate me into feeling guilty for standing up for my daughter. It was too much. "This conversation is over," I said, my voice low and steady. "Stay away from my house. You are no longer welcome." I hung up before they could say anything else, the weight of the conversation sinking in. My heart was racing, but I knew what I had to do. I would not let this go. Emma's safety came first, and if my in-laws weren't going to respect that, then I would make sure they were held accountable. As I stared at the ceiling, the world around me felt distant, unreal. The pain of the surgery was still there, but the emotional pain was sharper, more persistent. I wasn't just grieving the loss of Michael anymore. Now, I was fighting to protect Emma from the very people who should have been her protectors. This was just the beginning, but I would see it through. For Emma, for Michael, for the safety and peace of my family. I would make sure this never happened again. The day I left the hospital, I felt a sense of relief that was bittersweet. Janet picked me up, and as we drove back to my house, she filled me in on Emma's night. Despite everything, Emma had managed to hold it together. But she was shaken, of course. Janet told me that Emma had kept asking if I was really coming home that day. And I could hear the worry in her voice as she spoke. I could feel my own heart ache at the thought of my daughter. So young and vulnerable, left in a state of confusion and fear by the people who were supposed to be her protectors. When we got home, I was greeted by an eerie silence. I hadn't been there for a few days, and the emptiness of the house, while familiar, felt overwhelming. But then I saw Emma. She came running towards me, her face lighting up as she threw herself into my arms. "Mommy, you're back," she cried, her voice breaking with emotion. I was so scared. I held her close, my own tears threatening to spill. I had missed her so much. But I also felt an overwhelming sense of guilt. She had gone through something so traumatic while I was unable to be there. She had been abandoned by the very people who should have been there to support her. But in that moment, I also knew I had done the right thing by standing up for her. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that, sweetie," I whispered, fighting through the pain of my surgical incision. "You're safe now. I'll never let anything like this happen again." We spent the rest of the day together, trying to find some normalcy amidst the chaos. Emma, ever the trooper, seemed to find comfort in the familiar routines we'd always shared. But I could see the remnants of the fear in her eyes. It wasn't something that would just go away overnight. Later that afternoon, as we settled back into our home, I felt a surge of determination. I couldn't let my in-laws think they could just waltz back into our lives after what they'd done. I called a locksmith to change the locks on the doors, both the electronic codes and the physical locks. I needed to protect Emma, to create a safe space where no one could just walk in without our permission. As I did all of this, Emma watched me carefully, her little eyes wide with curiosity. "Are Grandma and Grandpa coming back?" she asked quietly. I paused for a moment before sitting down next to her on the couch. "Not for a while, honey," I said gently. "What they did was wrong and dangerous. They left you alone when you needed them most. And that's not something we can just forget about." She nodded, her face solemn. "They said I was being a baby," she murmured, looking down at her hands. "Grandpa said Daddy wouldn't be proud of me for being scared." My heart clenched in my chest. How dare they use Michael against her? How could they manipulate her grief like that? "Your daddy would be incredibly proud of you," I said firmly, taking her hands in mine. "You were brave to call me when you felt unsafe. That was the right thing to do. Emma, you were never a baby for wanting to feel safe." We stayed close the rest of the evening. And though things were far from perfect, it felt like the first step toward healing. But I knew the battle wasn't over. My in-laws weren't going to just accept their wrongdoing. The confrontation was coming, and it was going to be messy. The next morning, as I prepared for what lay ahead, my phone buzzed with messages from Gerald and Barbara. They were upset, of course. But now they were trying to control the narrative. The calls and texts were full of accusations, asking why I had reported them to child services. I felt the anger rise in me again. But I kept my composure. Then, just as I expected, my phone rang with a call from Peter, Michael's brother. He seemed concerned, but I knew this conversation wouldn't go the way I hoped. "Tina, you need to calm down," he said, his voice strained. "Mom and Dad are beside themselves. They say you've reported them to the authorities and changed the locks. You're making a mistake." I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. "Peter, they left a 10-year-old child alone to go to a party while I was in the hospital. You would have done the same thing, wouldn't you?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. No, I wouldn't have," he admitted quietly. "Well, that's the reality of the situation," I said firmly. "I've done what I had to do. I reported them because they endangered Emma, and I changed the locks to protect her. They're not welcome in our home until they take responsibility for their actions." The silence on the other end was telling. Finally, Peter spoke again, his voice softer. "I understand. I'll talk to Mom and Dad. This has gone too far." I hung up the phone feeling a small sense of relief. Peter's support, even if it was unexpected, felt like a lifeline. At least one person in the family was beginning to see things from my side. Later, as I sat in the living room with Emma, I realized that no matter how hard things got, I couldn't let fear or guilt control me. I had a duty to protect her, and I was willing to fight for her safety and well-being, even if it meant going up against family. This battle wasn't just about what had happened, it was about ensuring Emma never had to feel abandoned again. And no matter the cost, I would fight to make sure she felt safe, loved, and protected every single day. In the months that followed, things slowly began to settle. The tension between me and my in-laws was far from over. But there was a shift in the air, one that made me feel like I was finally taking control of my life, my family, and my daughter's future. The therapy sessions had been tough, but necessary. Gerald and Barbara eventually admitted their mistake and agreed to take a grandparenting education course. We established new boundaries for the sake of Emma's well-being. The most important thing was that they understood how serious their actions had been. And while it wasn't an easy journey, it was a start. For Emma, things were improving too, though the scars of that traumatic experience would take time to heal. I could see her starting to relax again. Her smiles became more frequent, and the anxiety that once clouded her every moment began to lift. It was a relief to see her feel safe once more. I had protected her from harm, and in the process, I had learned something about my own strength. Through all of this, I realized that real victory wasn't about revenge or punishing others. It was about ensuring that the people we love feel safe, heard, and understood. It was about transformation, not destruction. I didn't just want to fix the relationship with my in-laws. I wanted to build something healthier for all of us. So, as I sat on the park bench watching Emma laugh with her grandparents, I knew that while the road ahead would have its challenges, We were on the right path. And that, in itself, was a victory. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more life stories that touch the heart.